This week I'm joined by Justin Murphy, a political scientist whose research has been published in the British Journal of Political Science and popular outlets such as Foreign Affairs and New Statesman. He is also the author of Based Deleuze, the Reactionary Leftism of Gilles Deleuze. He now works independently as a writer and podcaster. In this episode we discuss academia, political science, community, the internet, bureaucracy and independent work. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my patrons for making Hermitix possible, and if you'd like to join the Hermitix community or support Hermitix in any way, please find our Patreon, donation, merchandise and Discord links in the description below. Enjoy. Justin Murphy, finally on the Hermitix podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So for those of you who aren't aware of you, your background is now, I don't know, a bit peculiar, isn't it? Can you tell us about yourself, your past, and how you ended up doing what it is you now do, and why?
Yeah, sure. So I got my PhD in 2014, and I won the academic lottery, and I was able to secure a tenure track job. That was in England. I'm American, but I moved to England for a tenure track job as a professor of politics, political science, and that was cool for a while. I enjoyed it. And what happened was for the first few years, I buckled down and really put my head down because it's very competitive and challenging. So I had to really focus and hustle on getting out good publications. This is the academic game. And if you can get sufficiently prestigious publications and enough of them, then you get tenure. That's essentially the game. And so that's what I did for a few years. And I didn't write much on the internet. I didn't talk much at all. I never did or said anything at all provocative or even interesting in public, really. Then what happened was I succeeded and I got my good publications, and I was quite successful, and everyone in my department was impressed and satisfied with my progress. So I said, okay, now I'm going to start taking my freedom, because that's what academia is supposed to be, right? That's the whole reason I got into academia, is because of this idea that you pay your dues, you get tenure, and then once you have that secure paycheck and that perch in a kind of prestigious institution, then you have freedom, right? That's the whole allure of tenure. And so I guess I was stupid enough or naive enough to actually believe that and take it seriously. And that's actually what I started doing. So once I got tenure, mind you, this is the British version of tenure, so it's not quite as strong or powerful as the American version, but in England they call it permanency. I became permanent, and at that time I said pretty consciously, okay, now I'm going to start having more fun because I was really bored. I mean, I went into academia for this reason, and when I decided to start taking my liberties, I immediately started getting flack, and so it slowly and gradually became clear that the vision I had for what it meant to be an intellectual, for what an intellectual life is supposed to look like, which in my view is true, radical freedom to question everything and to say things that normal people are not willing or able to say. That's always been my vision from the day I got into kind of the intellectual game, probably when I was like 18 and first decided that I really wanted to pursue an intellectual life. Once I started to do it, started getting flack, and it became clear that there was going to be some sort of reckoning eventually. And so what happened was I just started investing more and more in my internet work, putting more and more, taking my internet content game more seriously and building real systems, automating a lot and really being quite aggressive and working hard on that. And eventually what happened was my internet project started taking off sufficiently, and at the same time, I was kind of like less and less happy with academia. So at a certain point, those two trends kind of intersected, and I got in trouble for the straw that broke the camel's back. Was I tweeted something one day that had the word retard in it, and a student didn't like this. They complained, and so I got suspended for that, actually. And when I got suspended, they were like, okay, now just don't talk about this, and we need to do an investigation. And the word I got from my colleagues was kind of like, okay, if you just kind of lay low, this will probably blow over. It's not like that big of a deal. And I was like, no, I'm not like being silent. I'm not going to sit in my house for potentially weeks or months on end in silence. Like the whole point of what I was doing was that like I don't have to take these orders. And so pretty much I told my dean straight up, I was like, I'm not going to be silent. Like I have successful growing platform as a truly free thinker and speaker. There's no way I'm going to put that on pause. Like, in fact, if you're suspending me, I'm now even going to have more time to work on that. And thank you for the free time with a paycheck. And that's what I did. I told them I was going to keep doing whatever I wanted, and I doubled down. And I wasn't supposed to talk about the investigation, but I told my audience all about the investigation because it's hilarious, right? Like, I'm a social scientist. I have an obligation to comment honestly on what is going on in the social world. Because my dean tells me, keep your mouth shut, doesn't mean I'm not going to talk about what's actually going on, which is a fascinating process in the university. Like, that's what I have to talk about. I'm a social scientist, and yeah, that's pretty much the TLDR. And I decided I ultimately, the way the situation resolved itself was I just decided to go my separate ways. They were probably maybe going to try to fire me. It's not clear if they would have been able to. I probably would have had a very good position if I wanted to fight it legally. I'm just not that type of dude. I don't want to get involved in a whole year-long legal battle. The whole point of what I was doing was that all my creative intellectual stuff was taking off really well. I just wanted to keep going on that. I wasn't willing to pause that. So I also wasn't willing to pause that for some kind of idiotic legal battle. The fact of the matter is I decided to leave because I was never really happy anyway, and my internet projects and the financial returns on my internet projects were just barely compelling enough and growing enough that I felt confident in taking that leap and wagering my life on them in a way. And a lot of people kind of questioned why I quit, and they thought I should have, let them fire me or do this big battle or whatever. But the fact of the matter is, one of the things I wanted to signal is that it's not worth fighting for. Academia is a sinking ship. It's horrible. It's honestly really horrible. Like, I was never happy. The whole thing was a bit of a nightmare the whole time I was an academic, to be perfectly frank. I mean, there were cool people. I'm not talking shit about individuals. Most of my colleagues were awesome, for what it's worth. But I was really trying to signal to the world that, like, it's not even worth fighting. I would rather just leave. And that's what I did. And now I'm full-time just doing research, speaking, and designing any number of kind of creative entrepreneurial experiments to kind of package and share with the world my intellectual work. I've essentially disintermediated all of the academic functions, all of the academic value I was providing to the university institution. I pretty much chipped them off and reframed them and repackaged them for public usage. And I'm happy to say I'm now financially stable. I'm almost at 100% of my academic salary. In fact, only 1 year out. So I'm quite proud of that.
A couple of things there. You said academic hustle, and do you think that the structure that's put up there, getting peer reviewed, jumping through certain hoops, do you think that is sort of akin to the same hustle that you have to do on the internet? There's certain, it's not as, let's say, like aristocratic and professional as it seems. It is a bit of a hustle. Did you feel that way when you were in academia?
Oh, I mean, academia is definitely a hustle of sorts. You have to work extremely hard, for sure. You have to work long hours, and you have to compete aggressively, for sure. No doubt about that. But I would say the hustle on the open market is so qualitatively different than the hustle in academia. And personally, this might be a bit of a personality thing. I'm not sure if this would generalize to other people. I think there probably are some people who prefer academia, but the hustle on the open market, to me, is so much more fun and interesting, and it sits with me so much better. And I think the reason is, personally, that in academia, you're competing in what is primarily a social game. It's like 10% intellectual. Sure, people are kind of showing their intellectual firepower, and there's some selection based on who's the smartest and who has the best kind of research. So part of it is obviously a kind of old-fashioned kind of IQ competition and IQ filtering or sorting, but that's only a relatively small fraction of it. The rest of the game is essentially determined by social games. Who are you friends with? Who can you kind of ingratiate yourself with? Are the ability to detect what particular social groups are worth investing in and which aren't, and then the ability to kind of placate the groups that you want to placate, for instance, journal editors and these various little kind of petty gatekeepers. Your ability to basically climb those ranks and break into those different social groups is the lion's share of the competitive game in academia. And yeah, I mean, to me, that's just the opposite of intellectual life. It's actually quite orthogonal to it. And so winning the social competition always felt to me like a constant departure from and deviation from what I actually thought I was there to do and what I actually really wanted to do. Whereas on the open market, there's still a kind of compromise, right? Like there is always still going to be this conflict or tension between making money and telling the truth. There's always going to be a conflict there, but I have found sincerely in my experience in both worlds that one's ability to tell the truth and make money on the open market is much more consistent. It's much less tense and painful a compromise or painful a trade-off than trying to win these petty social games as a kind of and pretending that there's like intellectual content to it. Because in the open market, at least for me so far, if you have an intellectual diagnosis of the world that is correct, that other people don't have, then money tends to flow to you, right? That's your edge, right? So having access to some sort of truth that other people don't, if it is a real truth, then only time will tell. There's no way of knowing a priori. But if you see something that is real that other people don't, in principle, there should be a way for you to make money off of doing that. What's amazing about that is that no one can take that from you. It's sort of, you are interacting with objective reality in a way that if you're right, no one can stop it. Whereas in academia, you can have like a great idea, but if you're not able to ingratiate yourself socially with the right people, then your, quote unquote discovery doesn't even exist.
Mm-hmm. And do you think it was the problem, the straw that broke the camel's back? Do you think that was a problem just because it was a political course, or do you think that this problem would arise in even courses such as seemingly harmless, such as geography? Do you think it's a problem of control, or is it more specific to courses which can become more problematic, such as sociology or politics?
I don't quite exactly understand what you mean. Maybe just drill down a little bit.
So you were in a political science PhD.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so it seems to me that is the kind of course where they might be controlling what happens within the course because it is such a potentially volatile subject. Whereas if someone who had
I get the question.
Yeah. So if someone had tenure on a geography course and said something along those lines, I'm just wondering if you think it was specific to that niche.
Well, it's certainly not specific to political science as a discipline. You could say that it's what I'm describing here is more relevant to the social sciences as a whole, and certainly the humanities as a whole. But I mean, the social sciences plus the humanities, that's a huge swath of the university as a whole, right? So yes, I think in other, for instance, hard science domains, these problems are much less significant. But that's also because those people just don't have any reason to be talking about social issues. The way I see it is, as a political scientist, as a social scientist, I have an obligation to try to understand everything that's going on in society and to report it honestly. And so, yes, in that way, because society is my object of analysis, you're much more likely to observe these types of political conflicts with institutions. Sure.
Before we go any further, I do need to ask you the Hermitix question. So you can place three thinkers in a room, living or dead. Which three do you pick?
I have a clarifying question. Am I hanging out with them, or am I not hanging out with them?
You're sat in the room. You're sat in the room. So you could chat to them if you wanted to, yeah. Okay,
so I can facilitate the conversation.
Yeah, sure.
So in that case, I was thinking it would probably have to be... Okay, so I'm guessing that a lot of people will answer this question. They'll take it as a proxy for kind of who their favorite thinkers are, or they'll kind of like pick three thinkers to kind of signal their kind of unique identity or intellectual profile.
Yeah, there's a lot.
But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to try to. I'm going to answer it more objectively. I think I'm going to name three thinkers who I think they're not necessarily my personal favorite, but I think you'd have to pick them. I think it would have to be Darwin, Marx, and Freud, just because I think these three thinkers are probably the three most significant, original, and effectively revolutionary thinkers who would have so much to say to each other. And because in different ways they're all peeling off huge pieces of the same puzzle and at least roughly the same historical moment. And so I thought about this question, and I think you could come up with a bunch of very interesting combinations of thinkers. But in many cases, in many of the ones I wanted to suggest, I don't think they'd have too much to talk about, or I think they would be so different that I'd be worried. I'd worry that it wouldn't be productive. But I think if you could get Marx, Darwin, and Freud in a room, you'd have the best possible chance of just the most insanely interesting and productive discussion.
So you have a real interest in what makes people do what they do, why do people do what they do, and sort of what are the control mechanisms that are making people do that. This is sort of clear to me that this is this sort of your MO is, you know, as much as you have this intellectual work on top of this, it seems to me that your current trajectory is sort of a understanding of what makes people do what they do via creating structures which are making them do the things you believe they do. So, you know, for instance, you recently had a podcast episode on engineering negative social attention or negative virality, you know, negative virus. And it seems to me that, you know, in concordance with Darwin, Freud, Marx, your primary interests are why people are doing what they're doing, especially in relation to the internet.
Yeah, that's an interesting reading. I'd have to think about that. I'm not sure, to be honest. I think I definitely have a deep sympathy with a kind of overarching attitude towards society in which most of what is relevant and interesting is more or less hidden to the people who are acting it out. So that would be one way to say it that I've often thought about, which I think jives with what you're talking about. And I think, you know, that's one way to characterize the commonality between these three revolutionary modern thinkers. So yeah, I could see that.
This is the thing that I've sort of noticed about your work. It's that you know, whether or not you want to admit it at the moment, right now, you are sort of a master of this, of understanding the emptiness behind the act. So I mean, you're known for now saying things which are sort of, I'm not going to say attention seeking, that's completely the wrong word. They are, it seems to be nodes of attention which are just taken as sort of an experiment. You love experimenting with what it is that makes people engage. Do you think that all this attention is good in some form, that it eventually converts? Well,
I'd say a few things. First is that I think there's always been a historical association. I take this to be a kind of empirical law in some sense. There's an association between the genuine intellectual life and social opprobrium. This is just a kind of deep feature of how I see society. I think true intellectuals, almost by definition, bring on negative social attention. It's easy to think of many examples, right? Socrates was known as a gadfly, ultimately executed for it. You know, Diogenes, a kind of philosophical role model of mine, was, you know, everyone thought he was extremely annoying, and he was widely reviled by many normal people, although highly respected by powerful people, such as Alexander the Great. Jesus himself is sort of an example of this. Rousseau, another example of a kind of insistent, radical truth teller who earned, you know, extraordinary amounts of contempt and hatred from normies, as it were. You can think of many other examples. Nietzsche would be another example. And so I take this to be a fact. I take this to be a deep feature of what it means to be an intellectual. Now, this is not to say, and I've been very clear about this, I think, this does not mean that anything which attracts negative attention is therefore emblematic of the radical intellectual life. Of course not. But I do think that if you are pursuing a radical intellectual life and you don't pretty regularly face social opprobrium, then you're probably not really doing it right. So that's one empirical belief I have about what it means to be an intellectual and how society works. The second part of your question, though, I would clarify a little bit, because you asked me, do I think that negative attention converts? I don't think it converts. I would avoid the word conversion, because the fact is most people don't change their mind. I mean, this is just a kind of issue of social science, especially today in our highly polarized context. People don't change their minds. You can give people, if someone is a committed left winger, you can give them facts and data that really point in a right wing direction. And there's this phenomenon in political science research known as the Backfire Effect. It can actually increase their commitment to their left wing beliefs. And same thing with the right wing. So generally, as a political scientist, I take it for granted that normal people, the herd, if you will, just generally kind of chugs along, thinking whatever it will think in the direction that it wants to think, because people are essentially, not really reflective people. And so no, I don't think there's a conversion process at work that I'm interested in playing around with, but rather there is a kind of sorting process. And when you put out controversial statements or provocative performances of any kind, the relevant process is not conversion, but sorting. And so what is perceived by some people as negative virality is actually for other people, it's a sign of something positive. So this is also rooted in a social scientific idea, which I've been talking about for years now, and which I've been developing a lot more over the past year, which is this idea of costly signaling. This comes out of the game theory literature. And the basic idea here is that to communicate a true signal across a noisy channel, the speaker has to incur a kind of cost. And this might sound kind of peculiar, but if you think about it, it's pretty intuitive, because in a world where everyone can say whatever they want and it's super, super cheap, right, in a context of cheap talk, then most people's signals are not going to be reliable, right? When anyone can say anything full speed ahead, what you get is like the contemporary internet, right? It's just people putting out symbols on a regular everyday basis. That's pretty much just like promoting themselves, right? Everyone is pretty much just like trying to say whatever will get them resources. And in that context where talk is cheap and you're able to just put out as many symbols as you want with no cost, everything becomes noise. And that's the situation that we're in now. Everyone can relate to that intuitively. But that's actually a game theory concept. And I mean noise in a technical sense. Like when you look out at the Twitter or something like that, everyone is just kind of blabbering in a kind of conventional way, trying to pretty much promote themselves, because there's no punishment if they're wrong, right? Nothing bad happens to them in any event when you're promoting yourself. But if you are willing to put out statements or put out public performances where you actually do pay a price, then all of a sudden that statement or performance, it rises above the noise. It's a true signal. And that's a formal process that you can kind of demonstrate mathematically in the game theory, simply because the willingness for the speaker to take on that cost proves that they must have something worth saying. There must be something real there, because if there wasn't, why would they pay the cost? So that's the logic, and it's a formal logic, and I think it makes a lot of sense. And I think when you understand that, what you realize is that the only way to be a public intellectual in our context of just extraordinarily thick and dense noise, and just so many normal people doing nothing that even approaches the true intellectual life, but kind of presenting themselves as intellectuals or whatever, like journalists or whatever. The only way to get a message across to the world, to affect the culture, to create ripples in the social fabric, is to find ways to express truths where you are willing to take a cost. And so what you're doing is you're not converting anyone. So most of society is going to like hate you, call you a gadfly or whatever. This is like the phenomenon that has recurred throughout history, which I talked about. But when you put out a provocative statement and you take that cost, what happens is that maybe 10,000 people out there in that orbit of yours who are actually sensitive to the true intellectual life, they're actually looking for dangerous truths, and they're looking for people who are willing to put themselves out there to diagnose those truths and to express themselves honestly. Those 10,000 people will immediately see that costly speech as an indicator, oh, this guy is worth following. And this has happened to me repeatedly. So I really do think that this is essentially a social scientific hypothesis that is empirically demonstrable, because every single time I've said something that got me in trouble, I've picked up highly intelligent and often influential thinkers, makers, entrepreneurs, and the movers and shakers of the world who are out there looking for real signals. That's always going to be a small minority of people. So you have to kind of take the hatred of the kind of idiotic passive herd in order to get the attention of people who are really looking for real signals.
So you need to make a different form of noise within all the other noise, which finally gets everyone's attention to the point that they realize the normal noise is just static, and perhaps they're not actually looking for the sort of outstanding or alternative opinions which they believe they did. Do you think that, you mentioned truth a lot there, do you think that our notion and what we believe truth to mean is altered in the context of this sort of open communication framework, the internet? Do you think that truths are altered at all?
Well, I tend to believe the truth is eternal and does not alter.
So when you say that the people who are sort of such as yourself have got certain truths to say, you do just mean that in the normal context of truth. You don't mean anything unique by that.
I think the truth is unique, but I think the truth ranges from the mundane to the impressive. I think most of what most people say and do on an everyday basis is laced with falsehoods. I kind of take this for granted, and in part this is required, right? I mean, living in a practical way, it's kind of practical necessity to be constantly fudging things and constantly papering over things. It's especially if you're working with the social mass. Society is kind of held together by lies. I guess that's a kind of foundational part of my basic viewpoint on what the social world is. And I don't know, perhaps I take that as an axiom, but I think if you think that society is essentially held together by lies, then the truth is just any number of things, ranging from little things to big things, that for the most part you're really not supposed to say. And I think that domain of observations that you're not supposed to say is massive, and that's what I mean by the truth.
So you're sort of profiting off deconstruction. You're profiting off stripping back layers which people don't want to admit they love and find comfort in. So that's sort of the sorting thing you're talking about, is you put out a signal to say, look, I'm stripping this thing back. Are you the people who are comfortable with the reality as you now see it, or are you going to sort of, as you say, backfire and just ignore the signal you've put out?
Yeah, you could say that in a way. You're essentially trading the respect of 10,000 normal idiot people in order to gain the respect of maybe 50 smart, interesting, serious people.
Mm-hmm. And you think that's a healthy payoff?
Oh, 100%. If you're an intellectual, it's the only payoff. I mean, it's the of course, absolutely. It's an absolute no-brainer if you're a true intellectual. Mm-hmm. But frankly, I think what a lot of people don't really understand is that this is now dovetailing with economic incentives, because everything now is niche in terms of economic projects. Everything is going niche. And so to build something that is economically viable, you have to make this trade-off. If you try to make something for everyone, then no one's going to be interested in it. But if you make something for a particular niche and you can simply get the word out to that niche, then that's the type of stuff that people want. That's the types of stuff that people will pay for, and that's the type of stuff people get involved in. For what it's worth, I think there's a kind of deep there's a deep social and ontological even process at work here. So I'm thinking about the work of R. Scott Bakker, and I've written about this myself. I mean, I do think that reality itself is fragmenting in a very new way that we've never quite seen before. So I think the nichification of the economy is actually a kind of second order effect, or it's downstream of a much more primary and I think potentially irreversible process in which independent groups are essentially now having to kind of create their own realities and sustain their own realities. You already see this very clearly with the left and the right. I mean, I don't know if people appreciate how insane polarization is today. We've never ever seen this in the world, I don't think, where you have half of Western countries living in one reality with its own assumptions, its own facts even, and you have another half of the reality living, in the same neighborhood sometimes, across the street with a completely different reality. Of course, there's always been disagreements across left and right, and potentially very strong and powerful ones. But even at times of like civil war, historically, the opposing sides of civil wars are often, they have the same map of the world. They just have powerful and deep disagreements about what should happen next. Right now, we don't even have we don't even have the same map, right? So the context of polarization today is in a way better and worse than old school kind of historical political conflicts, because it's better only in the sense that things like honor battles and civil wars and the actual kind of often violent conflicts that came about through older forms of polarization or kind of antagonism escalation are now no longer happening. That's kind of the good thing, but it's precisely because the opposing parties are literally not even in the same reality anymore, so they don't even have anything to directly kind of engage in violence over. But what's actually going on is now people are like, these different groups are in spaceships and they're kind of going off in divergent directions into outer space. And I don't think a lot of people appreciate how real that is and how drastic and significant that is. I think the nichification of the economy, if you look at the different startups that are succeeding and the different dynamics at the moment, everything is going niche. And that's only a downstream effect of this kind of extraordinary kind of fragmentation of reality itself. And so that's the kind of background empirical model I have that is also kind of significant for how I'm thinking about how the intellectual life needs to move forward to operate. You have to find a people. And if you can't find a people, you have to create a people. And the only way to do that is by putting out truths that diverge from what most people think.
Do you think this is such an act is only possible within this sort of new era of the internet that we're sort of going into, where the startup culture and the ability to basically plug into business dynamics, which prior to this new form of the internet were extremely difficult to plug into? Mm-hmm. Do you think it's only possible because of that, or do you think that this could be possible now in an analog means?
It's not only possible because of that, but absolutely it's being accelerated by that. I definitely believe that. It's so much easier now to build a successful business on the internet than it was even 5 years ago. Mm-hmm. I mean, there have been significant changes and improvements in this that are literally, within this decade. Namely, I mean, I'll give you a few examples because this is something I'm quite interested in. For people may or may not know that I'm actually building my own startup that is essentially trying to support other independent intellectuals and basically teach them everything I know about startup world, essentially, and convert that knowledge into applicable models for independent intellectuals to essentially go pro independently. And so I'll just give you two random examples of things that are brand new and significantly lowering the cost of being able to build significant businesses essentially online. Like one would be Stripe, for instance, the unicorn Silicon Valley company, actually from out of Ireland, the Colston brothers out of Ireland. But they basically revolutionized payment processing. Like payment processing wasn't even itself very well worked out very smoothly until very, very recently. It was actually relatively hard to set up your own structures to receive payments that are not intermediated through other institutions. That's one example. That's brand new, and it's now incredibly easy and smooth and flexible to create payment processes. Another one would be the no-code movement. I think the no-code movement is so interesting and important for kind of creative people and intellectual people, because essentially, I don't know if people realize this, but programming, computer programming and web development, like making actual fully functional web applications, doesn't even anymore require code. You can do it through completely visual building tools. This is known as the no-code movement, being able to essentially build all types of web apps without using any code. And this is going to completely revolutionize, I think, the nature of internet-based entrepreneurship, because what it means is that literally now anyone can create web applications without knowing how to code. So I think the number of people who could potentially build a legit internet business, it just increased dramatically even over the past few years, because the no-code movement is extremely new. So yeah, I definitely think there are many things going on right now that are seriously lowering the costs to building legit like high revenue, really impressive and sophisticated internet businesses. And frankly, not even a lot of people even know about this. Like, certainly not a lot of academics or intellectuals. So that's kind of like part of my kind of missionary zeal at the moment, is I'm trying to shout from the rooftops to academics, to other intellectuals. It's never been easier to build a financially viable structure of any kind, as long as you're providing value to some people somewhere. It's never been easier to do that. And I think that as a kind of financial basis for conducting intellectual work over the long term is much, much more promising than having to do it through a kind of bureaucratic alliance. The way that I think about it now at the moment is to pursue an intellectual life historically, you have to either make an alliance with bureaucracy, or you have to make an alliance with commerce. In one way or another, most models of making intellectual work financially viable, I think, ultimately boil down to one of those two. At least I think that's a useful framework. And of course, the academia is building an intellectual life in an alliance with bureaucracy. And the models I'm talking about now are building an intellectual life in alliance with the open market or commerce. And historically, maybe that the choice of bureaucracy was better. But now I think it's just painfully obvious that all the bureaucratic sclerosis and just accumulated slow, dead, resentful, terrible features of contemporary modern bureaucracy in Western countries is just so pathetically stupid and painful relative to the extraordinary dynamism and freedom and power at such a low cost that essentially commercial forms are now making available to people.
Do you think this is inherently libertarian?
No, honestly, I mean, on some level, sure. Like on one level of analysis, yes, it's a very libertarian gesture, but that libertarianism permits the creation of internal structures and internal cultures that can be very non-libertarian. So you kind of make this libertarian leap, but then that purchases you the power and freedom to create internal cultures that maybe are very anti-libertarian. So you can easily imagine kind of going on the open market, making this kind of libertarian jump in a way away from governance structure, from currently existing governance structures, into this kind of more anarchistic, capitalistic, libertarian kind of sphere. But with that freedom and with the ability to create value being so unleashed, then you can easily imagine people using that to create communities and create cultures that are, monarchical or, Christian democracy, or you name it. You can, and I think honestly, that's kind of what you're seeing, because a lot of the dynamics you're seeing are people want community. People really, really want community, and people are willing to pay good money for legitimate, valuable community. That is the type of community that they're looking for, and community is kind of the opposite of libertarianism on some level. And so the norms of those communities can and will be kind of shaped or evolved according to whatever the underlying preferences are for the members. And yeah, I think there's a lot of room for divergence from that libertarian kind of tendency. Like if people want a kind of strict kind of communist cohesion and radical egalitarianism within their community, then they're able to make that for themselves.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that's the way the future's going generally, towards a more sovereign and autodidactic sort of framework? Do you think there's a lot of distrust for bureaucracies, government institutions, academic institutions? Do you think that they are connected, or do you think that the sovereign thing is just sort of coming out on its own?
Yeah, I think they're probably connected. Well, first of all, I'll say it's beyond dispute that there is increasing mistrust of pretty much all mainstream institutions. I mean, we have good data on this, good survey data, and if you look at the public opinion data, it's very, very clear. Western populations are radically disillusioned with pretty much all mainstream institutions. It's trust of mainstream institutions pretty much across the board has been decreasing for several years now. And it's kind of frighteningly low in most domains. And so that's a fact. Is that connected to kind of the rising possibilities of sovereignty? I think there's an interesting complication here, because I think it's very unequal. And I think people just have to face the facts of this. for people who are intelligent and creative and able to develop and push forward difficult projects over time, then sovereignty is increasing for sure. But it is just a simple fact that human beings have different abilities to design and conceive and then push through over time difficult, interesting projects. That's just very unequally distributed. So it's always going to be a relatively small minority that is capable of, designing visionary ideas and having the conscientiousness to actually push them through over years across so many challenges that you inevitably face. So I think what's happening is, and this is frankly a kind of a bit of a red-pilled gloss on the content creator economy. I think what's happening is that social reality is fragmenting, as I talked about before. I take that as a fact. And in the anxiety and just the kind of existential horror and dread of reality itself breaking down, there is a massive latent demand for anything or anyone who can create some order, who can create some reality, who can create, in other words, structures of negentropy in this feeling everyone has of accelerating entropy. People really, really need and want structure and order. And I think this goes under the euphemism of quote unquote community or meaning. These are like the very popular kind of surface level words people talk about, the need for meaning or the need for community. I think what that really is reflecting is that social reality is fragmenting. It's horrifying and devastating, and most normal people aren't able to create order for themselves. Or they're not able to find meaning in the world themselves. So what's really going on is large sums of normal people are hoping for or waiting for smarter, more capable, and more conscientious people to create structures of order for them, to which they can join or subscribe to, and they're willing to pay for it. And I think that's essentially what's happening with the content creator, economy, or all of these dynamics go under different names. I think the Andreessen Horowitz people call this the passion economy. Your listeners might just know of it as the content creator game or the Patreon game, or the crowdfunding game. And so what's really happening, honestly, is there's this kind of mad scramble among entrepreneurs who are trying to kind of peel off pieces of this fragmenting social reality, and they're trying to own them as small kingdoms, small fiefdoms, and then they're bringing in people who are like them, and for money, in other words. So I think there's a kind of much more political, much more existential kind of underlying process to this crowdfunding or content creator or passion economy that we're seeing. I think it's a scramble by smart, creative, conscientious people to essentially build new worlds out of the fragments of the old, and then charge admission for other people with similar personality traits as the founder or content creator. And so the political polarization you're seeing over the past few decades with left and right is now accelerating into micro niches based on essentially very fine-grained aesthetics and personality traits.
Mm-hmm. And do you think, it seems to me that you're primarily speaking of a creation of social reality which is primarily digital or virtual. If you agree with this, do you think that it already is seeping out from the virtual into the real, or the material, or do you think that is going to happen sort of all at once these niches are truly established? That's when you can sort of begin building, or do we not even need to affect the material world anymore? That's sort of an afterthought of the virtual.
Yeah, those are good questions. I don't know if you need to, but I definitely think the digital is kind of the initial vector of this kind of extraordinary fragmentation of reality, or in one of my essays, I call this the hard forking of reality. I think the digital is obviously a primary initial vector for the hard forking of reality, for the simple reason that, you can do things at scale, you can automate things, and it's obviously just much more powerful than trying to organize in meat space. So for sure, that's going to be the initial vector. But what you also see is that any kind of reality entrepreneur who is able to create a social negentropic structure out of this accelerating fragmentation of the world, one of the things that you immediately see following on that is a real desire and drive to do things in real life, IRL, as it were. And so just like to give you one little example, because it's fresh in my mind and I have the anecdotal data to share with you. I did my first ever live podcast event and kind of planned meetup. I've done small meetups here and there, but I did my first ever kind of big publicized live podcast event with a kind of special experimental hangout afterwards. I rented a mansion in LA for people on the internet who wanted to just meet up and talk about ideas and hang out for the weekend. And this is my first time ever doing it. And I mean, I don't want to like talk too much about my own projects or anything like that, but I'm only bringing this up, I swear, because it was really, really profound how people, like the feedback that I got. It was really kind of social scientifically profound because about 15 people came and stayed in this mansion that I rented in Los Angeles for the weekend. And immediately afterwards, like completely unsolicited, more than a few of them said like ridiculously nice and positive stuff, like that was the most amazing thing I've ever been to. I've never been to anything like this in my entire life, and I'm not making this up at all. It's like I didn't expect that. I didn't ask for feedback even, and so it was like holy shit, like all of this kind of online stuff that people are doing to kind of create new structures and create new communities. It's definitely there's an extraordinary kind of latent feeling and latent demand for having that bubble up into real life, into real kind of interpersonal face-to-face relationships and communities. And you already see this with other domains, right? Like conferences are really big. It's a huge market. It's a huge industry doing kind of niche conferences. People will pay mad money to go to some place where there are other people in their niche. And so the example I gave you from my own experience is just a kind of micro intellectualized niche version of something that you're seeing in other domains also. So yeah, I definitely think the digital will bubble back up into IRL until over time you're just going to see, I think, completely segmented niche realities, whole realities that are both digital and IRL.
So it seems to me that the communal and community aspects of which are assumed to be within universities, academia, bureaucratic structures, they seem to be non-existent. You're just left with the structure. Do you think that's what people are feeling, that when they enter into things which supposedly are meant to have communities, such as universities, etc., they no longer actually have them, and they're just left with the sort of mind-numbing structure of academia, and they're looking for it elsewhere?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, dude, think about how crazy this is. Indiethinkers.org, which I mentioned before, it's a membership community for independent intellectuals. There's a good little handful of students who are already paying good money to be a part of a university, who are now going out of their way. They come to me and want to pay me to be a part of my independent intellectual community on the internet. Think about how crazy that is. But it's extremely demonstrative of exactly what you're talking about. The university is a kind of shell that claims to do a bunch of things. It claims to solve a whole basket of problems: community, intellectual development, learning, teaching, and a bastion for ideas. It's essentially none of those things anymore. It's just this kind of inert kind of memory of those things, and it's so costly, and yet people are still looking for it elsewhere. So I take that to be kind of incontrovertible, kind of data-based evidence that of this claim that the university is just failing. Because it's easy to say that. It's easy, cheap talk is easy. It's easy to just kind of criticize the university. But when you actually look at people's behavior and what they're willing to pay for, I think it's a much more powerful testimony.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that keeps coming up, and I know you're a really big fan of it, is Silicon Valley culture generally, which is sort of hard to describe if you haven't got your finger on the pulse of it. But it's to me, it's sort of a form of like hyperproductivity, sort of min-maxing elements that people would never think that you could sort of control and affect. And do you think this form of culture, this Silicon Valley culture, which seems to be affecting and infecting the entire West now in certain forms, everything's getting monetized, everything's getting commodified, everything's like super cybernetic and managed. Do you think this is bad, or is this something you're really enjoying? I guess you're enjoying it as a social scientist.
Well, again, I think what's really at stake here is just a difficult reality of inequality. I'm not sure if your listeners would be familiar with a concept out of the economics literature, which I've made a lot of this in the past few years. I've written about it and talked about it in various pieces. But I think a really important concept for people to understand is this notion of what they call skill-biased technological change. And really, that's just a long-winded way of saying that with the advance of digital technologies that we're seeing, since World War II, roughly, for people who are gifted with certain traits, this increases their income. Technology increases the income of certain people who are, let's just say for short, highly skilled. And for people who are not highly skilled, it makes the situation worse for them. Okay, so the advance of digital technology has this really difficult, troubling, kind of divergent effect for different types of people. And this is a crucial kind of background empirical reality that people have to understand to be able to process, like, what even is Silicon Valley? What does the culture of Silicon Valley represent? What it represents is that if you're highly skilled and you're good at designing systems, you're good at following through on the creation of systems, then the digital technologies and their advancement are increasingly good for you. But if you're not good at building systems, or you're not good at following through on the construction of systems, then digital technologies are going to make your ability to survive even harder, even worse. And so, to answer your question, the reason I have to talk about this to answer your question is because I think inequality is terrible. I think it's destroying the social fabric. I think it's terrible. I mean, I am, at the end of the day, a kind of communist and a Catholic. Like I do think that it's ethically necessary for people to figure out ways to take care of each other in a kind of unconditional way. So on the one hand, kind of what Silicon Valley culture represents, hyper-productivity, all of these kinds of associations people have with Silicon Valley. On the one hand, it is emblematic of everything that's kind of terrifying and horrible about the world, right? Because it's hard, people have to work harder and harder, right? People have to work more and more to keep up, right? And there are large numbers of people who are being kind of swallowed by this rat race because they can't keep up. They just don't have the kind of biological hardware to be able to do the type of work at the rate that it needs to be done in order to survive in today's society. And so that's horrifying. I don't like that. No, I don't celebrate that. I think it's terrible, but I do think it's an empirical reality. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I think one has to always grapple as radically as possible with just whatever is the case and work from there. And so if that is the case, and I think that is the case, I think the literature bears that out, then all it means is that to whatever degree you are capable of, you have to try your hardest to design systems and to create functional systems and to stick with them over time and follow through on the difficult challenges of building functional systems. And if that is something that and if everyone can only do that as best as they can, you might find yourself blessed and lucky to learn that actually you're good at it and you are able to do it and you are blessed with the traits or the gifts that allow you to do that. Now look, I'm not as smart as Mark Zuckerberg. I'm not, right? I'm not as smart. I do not have the IQ of highly successful, genius Silicon Valley CEOs at all. So I'm not like glibly putting myself in the camp of, the super smart, creative visionaries who are succeeding on the back of skill-biased technological change. I'm not saying that, but I am relatively gifted. And it turns out I do have a little bit of what it takes to design systems and to that work and to kind of scientifically iterate them over time. And so all I'm really saying is that for me, yeah, I'm quite pleased navigating this new world of a kind of tech startup culture. And for what it's worth, by the way, I mean, I just think that these Silicon Valley kind of norms of how to launch startups and successfully, and how to run things, how to be maximally productive, and all these sort of norms and ideas that are associated with Silicon Valley. Yeah, I think it just represents like optimally intelligent work, right? It's just optimal efficiency is all it is. At the end of the day, it's just the scientifically iterated optimal format for being maximally productive. With the most scale and the most leverage, using essentially science essentially, right? So that's all it represents. And yeah, for someone like me who's relatively blessed in certain ways, not super talented in any particular way, I'm quite enjoying it. Yeah, fuck yeah, it's awesome, right? Compared to academia, compared to like having to play these like insanely stupid, sclerotic, kind of socially and politically idiotic and corrupt bullshit arbitrary games. Fuck yeah, like all these technologies and everything that's possible to do on the internet. Fuck yeah, it's amazing. It's awesome. I'm loving it, of course. But the ability for people to enjoy that and to do that successfully is radically unequally distributed. And this goes back to what I was saying before, that what this means is that the obligation for people who are, if you are able to design new systems and create them and follow through on them, and you're able to provide that neg entropy or that structure for other people, you have an obligation to fucking do it full speed ahead. But you have to like love and support the other people who are in your community. So I think be honest about inequalities, but also be honest and be kind of radically insistent about within the cultures, within the communities that you're creating, building like the most humane or ideal kind of political distributions as you're capable of producing. That's my take.
Okay. And I think to finish up here, do you want to just chat a little bit about your, what it is you're making at the moment, which is, I mean, I don't know if you have any other projects on the go, but I think Indie Thinkers is your main one. You've said a little bit about it, but I don't know if you wanted to just finish up by telling us about it.
Oh, I mean, I kind of already feel bad that I accidentally kind of plugged it a couple times. I honestly didn't even think to do that. So I don't want to plug it too hard or too bad. I mean, one thing I'll clarify though is that I'm still committed. Part of my mission, my underlying mission that I left academia with, is that I'm going to figure out a way to maintain at all costs a life that is primarily about me doing my own research and producing my own research. So, for instance, if like I were to do a startup and then fast forward 2 years and people look at what I'm doing and I'm just a full-time CEO of a startup, I would consider that a failure. I am trying to do something I think quite unique. I don't just want to be financially successful or be financially free on the open market. I want specifically to pioneer a new model of the intellectual life. And to do that, that means I have to make sure that, at least, let's say 51% of my actual waking life, the actual work that I'm doing on a daily basis, I want at least 51% of that to be me reading and writing and thinking and speaking in a radically disinterested way, just pursuing the truth and developing my own long-term intellectual research agendas and projects. So that's a kind of a priori commitment that is part of just the substantive goal or mission that I've set myself to for my life. Now, but of course, you have to kind of hustle to do whatever it takes to pay the bills and to have a kind of economically viable life, of course, right? So the startup that I launched a few months ago, indiethinkers.org, it's just a private membership community on a subscription basis. And the mission is to basically support any other independent intellectuals out there in whatever way I can. And I'm kind of iterating that in a kind of open-minded way, just based on what my members are telling me. I'm trying to have a very kind of scientific testing attitude towards it and constantly updating based on the reality of what people want and need. But at the moment, it has a few main features, and I basically just designed these from asking people. I just did a ton of user interviews. I just kind of asked people to do a Skype call with me to tell me about their goals and their problems, specifically like what are they struggling with the most. People who I see as representatives of the independent intellectual life. For instance, I think I got you on a call, I think, a few months ago. Yeah. I basically just asked people to tell me what they're going through. And I took that data and I just designed a few features that were specifically responsive to that to try to solve those problems. And without going into it too much, there were certain problems that pretty much everyone said that they were facing as independent intellectuals. And the common ones were like lack of social community. They're just isolated. They don't have anyone else to talk to about it. Okay, I'll come up with a way to provide that. People want feedback on their work. They don't know how to get feedback because they don't know people who can give feedback. Okay, I'll find a way to create feedback structures and so on. There were a few other kind of common problems that people had. So I just built a membership community on a subscription basis, and I built some structures and systems to provide those things to people essentially. And it seems to be taking off. It seems to be doing quite well. It's kind of growing faster even than I was hoping it would. And but I don't want to be doing that more than, let's say 49% of my time, because I would consider that a failure. So my goal is, at the moment, I'm working on it really hard. It is occupying a lot of my time because I'm building it, right? But the amazing thing about digital businesses is that you can automate a lot of it once you do the processes by hand, and you figure out once you have the right model and you know it's what people want and it's delivering value and it's actually worth it to people, then you can start automating. And so I'm not quite there yet. I'm doing a lot of kind of manual labor and hand-to-hand combat, kind of building this up. So it is kind of a full-time thing at the moment, but I'm still doing my other projects. I'm still writing books, and teaching courses is the new thing. I recently did a course with my buddy Johannes Niederhauser on Deleuze versus Heidegger on technology, and it was amazing. We had about 20 people pay a good chunk of money to be a part of this, and we did seminars, and they were amazing students. It was really, like, I kid you not, it was like better than, well, I don't want to. All my graduate students and undergraduate students at universities are also great. Like, I would never speak ill of them. It's not about them. It's about the institutional environment in which I used to teach undergraduate classes and graduate seminars. The institutional environment is just so limited and constrained that I can honestly say doing this online course, as a course, the course itself, I honestly believe it was better than any course I've ever offered within a university. And it's just absolutely amazing to say that, to be honest. And so, yeah, ultimately, it's not about me. Ultimately, it's about what I'm really trying to do is provide a demonstration effect. I think I want to show that it can be done. And I think once I show that it can be done, especially once I start sharing my finances, which I'm going to start doing soon, I think that tons of academics, especially early career academics or graduate students, are going to be like, holy fuck, why am I even in academia? Like, I'm just going to do what Justin does. And I think there's so much room for so many academics to essentially do what I'm doing because, as I said before, it's so niche. It's so personality based. There's tons of room, right? Because the people who want to work with me and join my communities and take my courses and read my books, it's a relatively particular type of person, right? It's based on who I am and what I think and my unique personality traits. So there's so much room for other people with different personality traits and different styles to be just as financially successful as I am. I don't see people like you and me as direct competitors whatsoever. And by the way, let me just get this on the agenda because it's a major fucking pet peeve of mine. Our space is dominated with just really, really negative sum thinking and bitter, resentful, anxious kind of competitive mentalities. And I just want to call this out there because I suspect people like I don't know exactly who listens to your show, but like people who are in the kind of weird theory space trying to do highly idiosyncratic kind of intellectual projects such as yours, Meta Nomad, and mine. You're cool. Like, you're cool. We've always gotten along well, and I think you have a good kind of cooperative attitude. But so many people trying to do the things that we're trying to do have this nasty, close-minded kind of insecure, defensive posture where they only want to shit on other people. They don't want to do collabs. They don't want to do positive sum games. And I think it's so fucking stupid. And it's so sad, honestly, for them, because the fact is our niche is still so small and undeveloped that, like, I want to see you succeed, Meta Nomad, because if the more you succeed, the more you're going to popularize this whole culture, the more you're going to normalize this market, the more you're going to, if you succeed in Meta Nomad, you're going to increase the number of people who even understand what this means, which is going to be good for me, and it's going to bring more people into my orbit. So I think when you're in a relatively obscure, undeveloped niche, all of the people trying to create projects have to be all the more generous towards each other and all the more collaborative because they have so much to gain and they have almost nothing to lose. Like the number of people who even understand what we're doing and this kind of these new intellectual worlds and communities that we're trying to create, it's so tiny at the moment that like the competitive defensive mentality is so just unfounded and stupid. We all have so much to gain by collaborating and finding positive sum games. And I think it's just so sad at the moment that there's so many kind of petty, small-minded people in our spaces who aren't thinking like that. I just want to call that out.
Yeah, well, I sort of want to continue on that because we don't have to go on for too long. But one of the things I've found is, like, since going full time on this is, to all the people that have supported me, I'm extremely, extremely thankful, and it is a lot of support. But one of the things that surprised me is, like, when I look at my views, when I look at the analytics and the data, I'm like, it only took this much to get to where I am. Like, it's not much. People, I think the representation of what it's like to sort of be successful in this frame is held by people who are, like, super successful and have millions and millions of views. And that is not the reality at all. Like we're talking about niches, and like once you're in a niche and you've found it, you don't need that much at all. You know, you need, like you said earlier, a small group of 50 to 100 really interested people is so much better than 10,000 uninterested people. And that would be my message to people so far, is like, it doesn't take much at all. It just takes a lot of work, and like, make the stuff, don't keep thinking about it. But like, in terms of the sort of competitiveness, like you said, like mine and your projects are like, they are only alike in the form that they're taking it. You know, we're part of the intellectual sphere, and we're the intellectual life that you're building. We're sort of part of that. That's our form. But in terms of actual content, we're miles apart. Now, in terms of actual competition and being competitive with each other, there is podcasts that you would, when you look at face value, are extremely alike mine and are extremely alike yours. But when you actually go on them and start listening to the content, you begin to notice massive differences in why certain people would like certain things. So one of the ones that's really like Hermitix is one called The Higher Side Chats. And the guy Greg on there is way more laid back than me, which some people love. Like, it's one of the reasons I'm not a massive fan of the Joe Rogan show, is I think he's too laid back. But ultimately, you can the tiniest thing can push away a crowd, but that same thing can draw in a different crowd. And like you said, it's character traits, and that's important. And the whole competitive thing, it's like, it's not a whole. I'm not coming at it like a everybody work together, hold hands, blah blah blah. But it's like, support a project, because ultimately you're just boosting that sphere. You're boosting you're boosting the entire new intellectual life, and there is a lot of that. I've noticed that as well. But I just sort of get on and make, because my sincere interest in the subjects comes before anything else. That was always the thing for me. Mm-hmm. Probably still the same for you.
Mm-hmm. Of course, for sure. I just think it's insane that other people don't realize that the positive sum games are so much better for especially people like us. So, like, for instance, I want to actually explain this to people, because I honestly think they don't understand. I think if they actually understood the economic and empirical reality, they might actually change their style of interacting with each other. So real quickly, I'll just kind of explain what I'm talking about. So let's just make up some numbers to fix ideas and do a scenario. Like, if let's say you and I represent something like a kind of ecosystem, I tend to call it just like the weird theory space. Mm-hmm. People doing kind of pretty intense abstract philosophy and science stuff, kind of off the radar or off the coordinates of kind of mainstream intellectual circles. There's a bunch of us, right? Very, very different, almost so different that I'm not even sure many other people have a kind of consciousness that we're relatively in the same kind of ecosystem. So we are currently so fucking small, relatively. Like, our audiences are relatively extremely small, and that's in part because of the millions of people out there. Most of them don't even know that we exist. They don't know that there are people like us doing the type of content and community building that we're doing. So basically, people in our niche, if I can do anything, MetaNomad, to double your success, what it really means is, first of all, no, I'm not going to lose anything whatsoever, because the people who are interested in you and want to be a part of your content and your community are simply different people than the types of people who are going to be most interested in being part of my niche, right? My kind of sub niche.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing, is you simply don't lose anything because of this kind of radically personality contingent process that you just described, and which I described before. That's the first thing. You simply don't lose anything. But think about what you gain. If I can do anything to double your success, then what that means is more people are going to hear about the simple fact that our niche exists as a whole, right? So, like, if I can double your subscribers, MetaNomad, what that means is those people's friends and families and associates are going to hear, oh, there's an online world where people are doing like sophisticated philosophical analysis or scientific analysis and research that's completely off the grid of mainstream academia or intellectual life, and they're actually smart and they're actually consistent and they're really doing something real that's persisting over time. Oh, that even exists. So from you doubling your subscribers, MetaNomad, maybe 3 times that number will hear about the fact that we as a whole, as a niche, exist. Mm-hmm. And what that means is that's going to bring in new people who look into you, and then they want to look into who are other people kind of like you, and then they'll find one who is more suited to them personally. And so therefore, the way I see it is, if I can double your subscribers, MetaNomad, I'm going to, in the long run, probably also be doubling or more my own subscribers and my own community in the long run, because there's just so much to gain from the larger market that we currently have almost none of, right? We're so niche. So that's basically like the economic logic that I really want people to understand, because I am stunned. I'm stunned how many people out there in our niche who have like no more influence or power or success than I have, are like snooty or dismissive or judgmental or defensive or like not interested in building positive sum games. It boggles my fucking mind. It really boggles my mind, because if we all just played more positive sum games and weren't so fucking like holier than thou, kind of shitting on each other, like we could seriously bootstrap our tiny little niche into this like big visible cultural presence, and everyone could potentially triple, quadruple kind of the size and the impact and the significance of what we're all trying to do. So I just really kind of want to put that on the agenda and make the case and shout that from the rooftops.
Okay, I think that message of just support each other, you're not going to lose out, is a good place to finish up. So,
all right, man.
Justin, thanks very much.
Thanks so much for having me.